Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your brand new source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. We are here with another episode this offseason, doing one a week this offseason, talking about the NFL draft, kind of starting up our coverage on that, and specifically through a Packers lens. Before we start with anything, though, we just wanted to make a couple quick pitches. If you enjoy what you hear here, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We would really appreciate it. We tweet out when we have new episodes, articles we find interesting, Packers news regarding free agency right now, injuries in season, and any other news that might come along our desks, so to speak. We tweet out any interesting videos, some mock drafts, stuff like that, so come give us a follow there. If you enjoy what you're listening even more, come subscribe to us on YouTube. You can find our podcast episodes there. We are dealing with a bit of technical difficulties on that end, but it would also help our numbers a lot, and we would really appreciate it. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts. Anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find us. And so, without further ado, let's start talking about the draft. We got a couple news items to go to, but before we do anything, my name is Tommy. I am one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, my dad, Matt. Dad, that was a lot of an intro, but how are you doing?
It's a long intro, but I'm doing all right. It's we're into the off season. We're into NFL mock draft season. We're into Rogers Groundhog Day season.
Yep, he's
waiting
for the
shadow.
Yeah, he's somewhere out there waiting to see Bill Murray. But anyway, this episode is going to be our first official mock draft of the season. I don't know if you can hear the excitement in my voice, but this is my favorite part of the year, is NFL draft season, my favorite day of the NFL calendar year. We got so much to talk about, but kind of to set the stage, we just kind of wanted to do a quick 7-round mock draft for the Green Bay Packers specifically, using the Pro Football Focus mock draft tool. Very good tool if you haven't used it. Kind of fun to mess around with different scenarios you might have. What happens if I draft this player here? What happens if I make this trade? Etc., etc. So we're going to be using that, doing a 7-round Packers mock draft. But Dad, before that, we got some Packers news this week.
We actually have some real news, not just what the hell is going on, speculation news. We've got Aaron Jones adjusting his contract to stay in Green Bay.
Yes, and this was something we had talked about a lot. I know I personally, and I know you felt the same way, his cap hit going into this year was going to be $23 million. And we had talked about this a lot of times. Hey, don't know if he's going to be back. He's definitely not back at that number. They might have to cut him outright. But as was reported by Adam Schefter on Friday, we're recording this Saturday night, instead of being released, Aaron Jones will be staying in Green Bay this season after the Packers and his agents, Drew Rosenhaus and Ryan Matha, reached agreement on an $11 million salary for the 2023 season that includes an $8.52 million signing bonus. So, good. Thank you so much, Aaron Jones. A player that I know I'm really excited to root for and watch. Exciting on the field, great guy off the field. It was going to be really hard to say goodbye to him, but him taking one kind of for the team, taking that pay cut this coming year to stay with the Packers and add another year. Dad, I don't know if you saw, he's actually kind of crawling up the record books of Packers all-time rushers, slowly but surely. He plays a few more years here, you never know. But so he's under contract for another 2 years with the Packers. He didn't extend or anything, that's just what his existing contract was. Dad, how did you feel about this?
I felt good. I was expecting him to come back, actually. However they managed to rework the contract, whether they just did a simple restructure, kind of depending a little bit on other salary cap issues. But with this restructure, they reduced his 2023 cap hit from like around $20 million, I think it was before. And now, according to over the cap, it's just over $8 million. Next year's cap hit will be $17 million, and he's got 3 void years after that. So in 2025, when he's no longer signed to play, he'll have another like 11 million. Is it 11 million cap hit? No, 6 million cap hit when it voids, I think, in 2025. So essentially a $31 million contract for 2 years, what he has right now. But it does get them close to getting under the cap, which they have to do by the start of the league year. And so we'll see what else they have to do. There are a bunch of contracts that could restructure, but great to have one of the true good guys in sport. A guy who literally has been seen helping little old ladies in the airport.
Yes. He was the Packers' Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee for this past year. Everyone loves Aaron Jones. He was pretty much their whole offense for good segments of the year last year. Pretty much the whole first 6 or 7 weeks, he was easily their best player. I would say he's probably their best player on offense for the majority of the year. They were going to really struggle to match his production and replace that if he wasn't back next year. So that is some huge news for the Packers, some really good news.
Yeah.
The other...
and he's...
Sorry, go ahead.
And before we go on, and he's actually been in some rarefied air for the league in terms of like number of carries and averaging over 5 yards per carry. And there are not that many people who have done it for as many different seasons as he has. So he's actually been... with not so much the big counting numbers, but really putting up some high efficiency stats.
Yeah, and I think I read somewhere he's one of only 2 or 3 running backs the last few years to average over 5 yards a carry and have a certain number of touchdowns. I want to say it was 40. There was like 1 or 2 or 3 of them. But yeah, rarefied air for Aaron Jones, real linchpin of this team and the locker room. Great to have him back. I don't think there's really much more to say there. I was kind of worried he wasn't going to be here, but he is, which is awesome. The other piece of news that we got is that actually Aaron Rodgers is probably in his darkness retreat right now, but the pieces of news that we have had trickling around, this is a little bit more rumor mill-esque, but interesting stuff nonetheless. A lot of reports that seem to be laying the foundation for the Packers to trade Aaron Rodgers, Dad.
Yeah, and so I think the latest one was what I think referring to the Bob McGinn I guess the podcast.
I was actually referring to the Silverstein one.
Oh, and then there's a Silverstein one as well, where so there are 2 different things about how the Packers are looking to move on. Right, the Tom Silverstein one was about how Gutekunst was commenting to an unknown NFL exec or something about how they should be looking to move on to Love in 2023.
I have the quote. I have the quote from the Silverstein one if you want to hear it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this was tweeted out by Aaron Nagler. It is an article by Tom Silverstein. The quote is, "At one point late last year, Green Bay Packers general manager Brian Gutekunst told an NFL colleague he was convinced it was time the organization move on from quarterback Aaron Rodgers and see what Jordan Love had in him." End quote. That was Tom Silverstein wrote that quote. So it kind of seems like, along with the McGinn piece, I am a little bit more skeptical of the McGinn stuff. It seemed a lot more opinionated and a lot less kind of even-keeled, a lot more sensationalized, in my opinion. Reading what was the quotes from the McGinn podcast part, it seemed a lot more like an op-ed, which is fine. But I think the Silverstein one seemed a little... Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I was going to say the McGinn one, I think he even says in the beginning, it's something about he figures, or it's in some way it's like his conjecture based on conversations that the Packers are ready to move on. And much more strongly sort of emotional about wanting to get rid of Rodgers and move on to Love, who is, ready to go, Rodgers 2.0, second coming.
Yeah, and there was a lot of stuff in the McGinn one that I think I saw quoted, which was like takes that made me not necessarily take the whole context of what he was saying with as much weight as I probably would have. But we don't need to go into all of that. But just basically, Dad, the talk around the town, so to speak, the talk around the tundra. Shout out podcast Talk of the Tundra. Go check them out. They're very good. They do Packers content. The talk around the town is essentially kind of, it seems like, laying the foundation for Aaron Rodgers to be traded. And that has kind of been reflected in the Las Vegas odds for what team he is expected to play for next year. You want to? Let me throw it over to you, Dad. Let me throw you this lob.
Speaking of Las Vegas odds for the Las Vegas Raiders as the favorite. So some of this reporting, even though it sounds kind of sensationalized, is actually reflected in the odds, where the Packers are not the favorite to be his team next year, based on the Vegas odds.
Not
the Raiders are the favorite,
or the second favorite. Last I checked.
Right. And last I checked, the most recent was Vegas 1, Jets 2, and then Packers 3. And so even though the language in the begin sounds kind of sensationalist, in some ways, it's not that surprising that they are ready to move on. It's kind of been the vibe. I think it's a little bit unlikely that this kind of information would be shared right now in a time that it would weaken their own bargaining position in terms of trades. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's a little bit odd, that if the team would let this kind of report out, that would then kind of shoot themselves in the foot when it comes to trying to get the biggest trade package for Rodgers.
Yeah, and kind of segueing this back into our main topic of discussion for today, which is our mock draft. I think what makes the most sense for this mock draft, because personally I'm leaning towards probably like a 65% thinking that Rodgers will be traded, 65-70 to 30-35 that he won't be traded. What we've decided to do for this mock draft is, oh, and by the way, those articles and quotes have been retweeted on our Twitter at FatherSonPacker. Go check it out, plugging it once again. We have decided that we are going to, for this mock draft and this mock draft tool, I'm going to start it up right now. We're going to start by going with what the Vegas favorite odds are, which is Aaron Rodgers being traded to the Las Vegas Raiders. And we're going to start with a trade that we think is fairly reasonable. We had talked about what seemed like a reasonable package. And I think what we had settled on, given the fact that Rodgers isn't exactly... Given the fact that the Russell Wilson trade did not go well for Denver, given the fact that Rodgers is not guaranteed to play many more years, given the fact that he's under a large contract, but also given the fact that he's won 2 MVPs in the last 3 years, he is Aaron Rodgers, a team that is close could make a lot of moves. I think he still has at least 1 or 2 good years left in him where he will be playing at that top level. And if a team wants to make that push, I wouldn't blame them. I think it makes sense. What we landed on as a trade package for Aaron Rodgers was 2 firsts and 2 seconds from the Las Vegas Raiders. That's a 2023 first and second, the 7th overall pick, and the 38th overall pick, and then a 2024 first and second. Seems kind of reasonable to me, Dad. What do you think?
Yeah, and of course, you see things all over the map, I would say. This might be a little bit on the higher side in terms of what people are throwing out there. Of course, some people throwing out there, oh, we should be able to get him for a third. It's like this crazy talk. Or like 5 firsts and change,
And
but
we've seen the report, though, that the Jets are willing to offer multiple firsts. We've seen that report from other writers. There is a bit of a precedent with this price tag being set for a franchise quarterback who has played at an MVP level before.
Yeah, and I would say it is, from the Packers' perspective, it is in their interest that, so Derek Carr is visiting the Jets. It'd be in the Packers' best interest if Carr does not sign with the Jets. And apparently the Jets are sort of doing their due diligence with Carr, if you believe the reports. But they still would rather have Rodgers if he's available.
And I mean, it could be some gamesmanship from the Jets as well. Hey, we don't need to pay you this big price tag for. We got Derek Carr right here in the other room waiting to sign.
We are in lying season from now through the draft.
And honestly, through training camp, like we go
through the season.
I was going to say it never stops, to be honest.
Because everybody's looking to not reveal more and get a negotiating advantage. Like, we'll be happy with Carr, whatever. You don't, we don't need to offer you very much for Rodgers. It's all lots of stuff going on. It's like, maybe we could get them to rush and trade us. But that's a lot of what's going on. Now, you may disagree with our take here that we're going for a first and 2 firsts and 2 seconds. But in terms of, I think, this mock draft, the first and second this year are, I would say, the pretty likely scenario. I mean, they basically got that for Devontae last year. And so I think even if you don't think they're going to get quite as much, I think the first and second this year are pretty good bet. And maybe if you want to downgrade it, you say, well, maybe they'll get a second next year instead of the first and second, or just the first next year instead of the first and second. But none of that will affect this mock draft. So we'll do this trade, and then we'll make our picks based on this trade.
And so, with the idea that we don't want to get too in the weeds for our first official mock draft of the year, this will be the only trade we will make. We've talked about this as we were setting up this podcast. When you get that 7th overall pick for the Raiders, oftentimes there is still a quarterback, whether it be sometimes CJ Stroud falls that far in this mock draft machine. Sometimes Will Levis falls that far in this mock draft machine. You never know if a team would want to trade up for Anthony Richardson. And so I think if one of those quarterbacks is there and a team wants to trade up, I could fully see the Packers trading down there and accumulating even more picks. This roster does have a lot of holes on it. But for
I've
the
had
purposes,
a lot of mock drafts.
But for the purposes of this mock draft, we're not going to make any of those additional
We're not
trades.
good.
We're just going to stick.
For my own mock drafts that I've done just for my fun, I have done many of those trades and ended up with like 6 picks in the top 50.
Hey, if the
It gets a little crazy.
If the Packers want to go that route, I would be 100% for it. If they just want to accumulate, I think it makes sense for them given the state of the roster. But for today, let's push through this Rodgers trade, Dad. Let's get this.
We'll keep it a little bit. So let me offer this trade, and the Raiders accept that trade.
And then we'll start the draft.
And now we'll start the draft. So we pop up to 7. And, yeah, as you said, C.J. Stroud is available. Players, let's say the PFF machine is saying are the top players who are left. So in this one, Jalen Carter to the Bears, Bryce Young to the Texans, Will Anderson to the Cardinals. That's actually pretty reasonable. Probably some of the most likely scenarios, I would say, for those first 3. Will Levis to the Colts, Brian Branch, little high to the Seahawks, Christian Gonzalez, it's a good cornerback class to the Lions. And they need some secondary help.
Yeah, so those first 6 picks seem pretty reasonable. The one thing I feel like is a bit kind of up in the air whether or not you believe it. Obviously, I will never really call one of these mock draft simulators totally off base or inaccurate just because the draft itself, every single year, there are surprises. In this case, though, the players that are available here, C.J. Stroud is available, which I think would be a little surprising within the actual context of the real draft. However, we have not had the combine yet, which does throw a lot of things in flex. We haven't had pro days yet, et cetera, et cetera. I think, Dad, what we've talked about in our reviewing the Packers season so far, we've talked about some needs that they have at edge, receiver, tight end, safety, and possibly some help along the offensive line. Is there anything that I'm missing? I don't think that they would take a quarterback here, even if Stroud is there, personally.
No, I don't think they'll take one. I think if it turns out this way, there's a good chance they could trade down just a couple of slots to either the Falcons or the Panthers, or even the
Titans.
Or even the Titans. That there would be a number of teams, I think, who would be willing to trade up that they could get something for. But we're not going to mess with that right now. But I think that would actually be a pretty strong position for the Packers if it turns out this way. But in terms of the players who are available, besides Stroud, on PFF's list, it's Devon Witherspoon, cornerback, Tyree Wilson, the edge rusher from Texas Tech, Quentin Johnston, wide receiver from TCU, Anthony Richardson, sort of the 5th quarterback on most boards, and
fourth quarterback on most boards.
Fourth quarterback on most boards.
And then you get down to guys like Lucas Van Ness, edge Iowa, Paris Johnson, tackle Ohio State, Kalijah Cansey, defensive interior Pittsburgh, Brian Brzee, defensive interior Clemson, Jordan Addison, wide receiver USC, et cetera, et cetera. At this 7 spot, Dad, for me, I would be between Tyree Wilson, edge out of Texas Tech, and Quentin Johnson, wide receiver out of TCU. In my opinion, I think Wilson has a really solid build. I know he didn't do much until his last year in college. For me, that's not too worrying. I think he's a little bit ball of clay-y in that he needs some more work, but we've seen before, like with Rashawn Gary, the Packers are willing to take those swings on high upside edge rushers and kind of let them develop. They have the players currently on the roster in Gary, assuming he's able to come back in a reasonable time frame from that torn ACL, Preston Smith and help me out, Dad. JJ Enigbare, thank you.
JJ Enigbare.
Where that they could have those players essentially take those snaps early on as Wilson developed. I could see that completely being an area they go with, specifically, especially given Preston Smith getting a bit older, Rashawn Gary coming off of injury and needing a new contract. And then I could also see them going Quentin Johnson. He is one of the bigger receivers in this draft. Most of this draft, it's kind of an average draft for wide receivers, and most of the receivers are fairly small. Jackson Smith and Jigba, very small. Jordan Addison, very small. Smith and Jigba isn't very small, but he is smaller. Zay Flowers, very small. You go down the list. A lot of these guys are smaller. more prototypical slot guys. Those would be
Yeah.
the two players that I would be between. Do you have any that you would want to add to this decision-making process?
I think the only other player he's a little lower on the board for PFF than some of the other sites. Miles Murphy, edge rusher from Clemson.
I was going to ask this because I actually personally think I might like Miles Murphy more than Tyree Wilson. I wanted to see what you felt about that.
I watched some tape of both of them, mostly highlights, so I haven't really watched like whole game tape. But they were both making plays. I felt like actually they both looked explosive around the edge with speed and also splitting the double team. I saw things to like for both of them, and it depends. I'm looking at another site right now that has Murphy ahead of Wilson. So that's something. So I think that some of the likely spots for the Packers in the first edge wouldn't be surprising. Safety is something I think they're going to need two of them. But maybe there's nobody.
Yeah, I just personally don't think it's. I don't think there's anyone this early, and I don't think it's the strongest safety class, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Branch is already off the board anyway, and he's the highest rated one.
And I don't even know if Branch is someone that they would want. He's very small. Also, no. He plays a lot like Savage. He's very similar.
He's very much like Savage. Plays a lot of slot. There are some other safeties I like more if you want like more run support, which is something that the Packers were really hurting for was more run support from the safeties, and something that fell off compared to the previous years.
Yeah, and it kind of fell off with Amos's play. Was kind of what I think really hurt. For me here, I would not go edge rusher. I would be very tempted to with the players that are on the board in Wilson and in Murphy. But I just think that the depth of the edge class is a lot better than the depth of the wide receiver class. And so I would be tempted to take Quentin Johnson here. I would be tempted to take Jordan Addison here. He's actually another player that I would like to enter into this conversation. He's not prototypical size for what the Packers look for in wide receivers. But he was the Blitnikoff Award winner 2 years ago at Pittsburgh with Kenny Pickett. Then he transferred over to USC this year. Didn't have as productive a year, but when you have a year that's as productive as his 2021 year, it's going to be really hard to follow that up. He still had really good numbers, averaged about 80 yards a game or roundabouts there. Had a really nice year, looked good on tape. He's a smaller guy. That is something to keep an eye on. And so for me, I would be kind of out on the edge position here just due to the depth at that place. I feel like they could get a decent guy at 15 in the edge class or a good guy maybe in the high second round pick that they got from the Raiders. I don't know what you think. I'd be between Johnson and Addison here. I'm leaning Johnson is how I feel about this pick.
So what I would like to say about this is I feel like the players who actually fit the Packers profile for receivers is a pretty short list. And in terms of opportunity, there's opportunity to get some edge rushers who will help and play for the Packers in later rounds. There are a bunch that will follow the second and others. And besides Johnston, there really isn't much in terms of somebody who's big as well as fast. And Johnson is kind of the main guy in the draft this year at that level. You know, Addison's not short, but he's pretty light. And then there are a bunch of small, really slot guys like under 6 feet, under 180 pounds. There are a fair number of those who the Packers have tended to shy away from. And as first-round picks, there aren't that many who have actually succeeded.
And the thing is, for Jordan Addison,
with that profile.
You say he is very small. He, according to College Football Reference, which we don't have official measurements from the combine or anything like that, they have him at 6 foot 175.
Right.
Which is very small for a receiver.
Right. He's 6 foot 175, Hyatt 6 foot 180. Smith-Njigba is a little bigger, 6'1", 200.
Zay Flowers
Josh
is apparently
Zay Flowers
5'9", 180, each of them, I think.
Nathaniel Dell, those guys are all like 5'10", 5'9", 180 or less. There are a bunch of players like that. And as first-round picks, those players don't usually live up to first round.
Yeah.
So I'd be in favor of John. I wouldn't mind Johnston here, even though it's a little unusual for the Packers to pick a receiver this high, just because there's not another one like him in the draft.
And that's the thing is, I think we need to talk about if they were to take a receiver here, that it would not be very on brand for them. It would be pretty out of character to take a receiver here. But I think that part of what goes into that decision for me doing this mock draft is that I think if this is assuming Jordan Love is going to be the quarterback next year, I think he needs more help than an Aaron Rodgers would need at this stage in his career. So I think you pay that premium for another receiver, give him these weapons around him, like you see the Eagles do with Jalen Hurts, young quarterback. You see what adding two high-level weapons around him does for his confidence and his ability out there. You see this with lots of other young quarterbacks. Joe Burrow, exactly, another one that comes to mind, where starting out really helps young quarterbacks' development to have these elite weapons around him. And so I am leaning Quentin Johnson here. If you're fine with it too, just a little spiel on him. I feel like he moves so, this is kind of a bit holistic, but he moves so naturally out there without the ball in his hands, with the ball in his hands, and he's huge for how well he moves out there. I know there are some concerns about his consistency game to game. I would argue that there would just be concerns about TCU's passing offense in general game to game. They didn't have the most dynamic passing offense in the country this year. I know he only put up like a single catch versus Georgia in the national championship game. Doesn't worry me too much. TCU was essentially drowning out there from the first second, and
it was in that game.
It was really bad for the whole team. I don't think it was just a Johnson problem. He did amazing in the in the championship semifinal game. So I would like to lock in Quentin Johnston, wide receiver out of TCU at 7. I think in real life they would probably trade down from this spot, but this is the player that I think that they would really help Jordan Love's development. I think is the biggest thing with this draft.
Yeah, and they only have 4 wide receivers under contract, 3 who've actually got any NFL experience under contract now. Yeah. So I expect them to add like 2 or 3 here with maybe they'll add a slot guy later. But Quentin Johnston it is. I think with him available here, we'll go ahead and maybe this is, the Packers will build up like they had. Remember how many receivers and how good the receiving room was in like 2011.
Yep.
Early in Rodgers' career.
And I can hear everyone saying Packers never draft a receiver that high, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is true. They haven't in the past, but they've also always had Aaron Rodgers. And I think the main point of this draft should be to help Jordan Love be the best quarterback he can be. And I think he needs more receiver help in that way. We sim down to 15. The players that went from 7 to 15, Dad, if you could just scroll up for me a little bit. C.J. Stroud went to the Falcons. Anthony Richardson went to the Panthers. So 2 quarterbacks back-to-back there in this simulation. Devon Witherspoon, corner out of Illinois, went to the Eagles. Lucas Van Ness, edge rusher out of Iowa, went to the Titans. Brian Brzee, defensive interior out of Clemson, who I really like, went to the Texans. Paris Johnson Jr., tackle out of Ohio State, went to the Jets. And then Peter Skoronski, tackle out of Northwestern, went to the Patriots, leaving the Packers on the clock. And Dad, some good players here, still available. And one of them that we had already been talking about them taking.
Tyree Wilson and Miles Murphy are both still available as edge rushers here at pick 15. And so it is true that there are also some good offensive linemen who are going to go in the first round, and 2 of them just went. So we could still get the same guy we were debating at the last pick.
And this is the thing. I think you do go edge here, especially with the edges that are on the board. And I think it is between, for me, Wilson and Miles Murphy. There is some little voice in the back of my mind talking about, hey, imagine how nice it would be to also grab Jordan Addison here. There's some thoughts on whether or not they might want to take a swing along the defensive interior and get a guy like Kalijah Cansey. I'm not in love with him like some other people are. And then I think that the offensive line is not needing a first-round pick necessarily right now. I think it needs a little bit more depth, but I don't know if they need another starter right now. So for me, I would be between
not a
Murphy,
first-round pick, because I think because usually for first round you get a tackle, and I think they're pretty good on tackles right now, as we talked about in the last show. If you're going to upgrade a spot,
it'd probably be center.
It would be center in terms of where the team's starters rank in the league. Myers is the lowest among their starters in terms of position rank in the league.
Not to forget, he's 5th amongst position rank in pass blocking.
His pass block ranking is his 5th overall, and then he was like 26th or something overall, but because his run block grade is not as good. Yeah, but pass block grade, was still good. So I don't think they're going to spend a first rounder on a lineman, and there's no safety in terms of positions. And I think that we'll get some extra defensive interior help, but I don't think this early. And the tight ends, I think it's a little too early still to pick a tight end.
And so for me, I'm between Murphy and Wilson here. And I don't know how you feel about each one. I think I might even like Murphy more, even though PFF does have Wilson a lot higher in their projections, and based on this simulator. Where are you kind of stacking up here?
They both are similar size, 6'5", 6'6", 275, which is kind of the size the Packers like for their edge rushers. Murphy, we don't know yet. I mean, I'm looking to say were they kind of estimating their 40 times. I don't know what data they're using for that. Has Murphy is a little more athletic, and they have him a higher grade as opposed to PFF that has Wilson as the higher grade.
Just to talk a little bit about some of their production numbers this year. Tyree Wilson this past year, in 10 games, had 8 sacks, 32 hurries, and 10 hits. And then Murphy this past season had, let me just pull it up, 6 sacks, 7 hits, 21 hurries in 13 games. So 3 more games, 2 less sacks, 11 less hurries, 3 less hits. However, he did have 9 sacks in 2021 with 33 hurries, compared to Tyree Wilson, on the other hand. He only had 6 sacks and 26 hurries in 2021. So 2 years ago, Murphy was better. This past year, Wilson had more production. Wilson kind of came onto the scene a bit more this past year. I think it's very close between the two of them for me. Let me double check what age group each of these guys are in as well. For Wilson, he is 6'6", 275 is their approximate, not official height weight. He is going to be 23 by the start of the year. And then Murphy is 6'5", 275, but he is only 21. And so I think that is kind of a deal breaker there for the Packers. They like to go younger.
Yeah, with that information, I think they'll go Murphy. I think their other profiles look pretty similar. Maybe Wilson's run grade is a little bit better, but I think the age is going to be the tiebreaker here.
Yeah,
so I say go Murphy.
And something I'm interested to see at the Combine, which will be coming up in like a week and a half, I think, 2 weeks, is arm length for each of these guys. I believe both of them are going to be at the Combine. Official measurements on that arm length are going to be interesting because I think that Wilson has longer arms just based on what I've watched. But I really like Murphy as well. So let's go Murphy here. Pick 15. I think going Quentin Johnson, Miles Murphy would be a slam dunk first round for the Packers. Would be very happy with that. I don't know how you feel about it.
We'll go Murphy being younger. I think Wilson's arms are projected to be really long. Like over 35, and Murphy's are more like 33 and a half projection. I don't know where, and I don't know. Some measurements for people came out at the Senior Bowl. I don't think either one of these guys were. Oh, well, maybe it was there because they do some measurements at the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, so let's go with Miles Murphy.
Let's go Murphy for the younger player. And now we've taken 2 picks, took sort of a premium position where you get an edge rusher in the first round, which I think you usually have to pay a first round pick to get a high impact player.
Yeah, and then this takes us all the way down to pick 38, which would be the second round pick that they would hypothetically get in that trade for Aaron Rodgers. Several players go between that last pick and the Packers' next pick. We don't want to be here the whole night, so we're not going to read off every single pick every time. But some players that are on the board here for the Packers that they might be interested in. Josh Downs is an interesting one if they wanted to go receiver again. Mostly a slot guy. I'm not super high on him.
He's pretty small.
Going down the list, Dawan Jones is an interesting tackle prospect out of Ohio State. He's had a really nice career at Ohio State.
I think he looked good at Senior Bowl too.
Yes, very nice Senior Bowl. Felix Anudike-Uzomah out of Kansas State is an edge that I personally really like, but I think that if they took Murphy, I don't know if they would go back-to-back on edges in that way. Dad, what are you thinking here at this spot? Where do you usually go when you're in a second-round pick spot like this?
So often in the second round is where I'm trying to grab a tight end and a safety. And so I just mentioned that after our last pick, the top 3 tight ends went off the board. Meyer, Musgrave, and Kincaid back to back to back in the 20s. Usually one of them makes it early second round, and we don't know what it's going to actually look like in a live draft.
And I'm willing, Dad. I'm willing to go on record here for the first time. Not a believer in Meyer, the tight end out of Notre Dame. I don't know if he has the movement skills to really thrive at the position. If you look at, do you want to give us your data on tight end athletes? Because I know you did some work on this between podcasts, and pretty much the quick overhead view of it is that you need to be an elite athlete to be a really good tight end. I don't know if Meyer is that. Take it away, Dad.
So I did just a quick analysis of the top 5 tight ends in receiving yards for the last 10 years. Just total yards. So you're talking about players who get in production, earning targets, and putting up big numbers. And then I looked at their RAS scores over the last year.
And RAS scores, for people who don't know, relative athletic score, takes into account position, size, and then athletic testing numbers.
Speed, explosion, agility. Anyway, there's one player who didn't have a RAS score, but 33 of the 49 had a RAS score over 9 in terms of the finishers. 33 of the 49 finished slots. So some of those accounting players twice had a RAS over 9. 23 different players finished in the top 5 in the last 10 years. And out of those players, 15 of the 22 had a RAS over 9. So that's being in the top 10% among NFL players at the position. And then 2 more were over 8 and 4 more over 7. There's only one player in the last 10 years who finished in the top 5 in receiving yards as a tight end and finished under 7, and that's Zach Ertz. Everybody else, there are a couple players in the 7s, Delaney Walker, Mark Andrews, Eric Ebron, and Cal Rudolph, and a couple 8s, and then all the rest were in the 9s. So all guys like Gronk, Kelsey, Kittle, Jimmy Graham, Dallas Goedert.
Pretty much anyone you
Eric
can think
Olsen.
of that is an elite tight end is an elite athlete. So what you want to be looking for tight ends, if you're aiming for upside, is elite movement traits. Because, the guys that are kind of plotting, the guys that are more blockers, they're kind of a dime a dozen these days. And as much as we love guys like Mercedes Lewis and what DeGuara brings to the running game, these aren't the guys that you invest like high capital, high level picks in. And so for me, the only one of those 3 guys above that have already been drafted that I'm super high on, you could maybe convince me on Musgrave. I need to watch a little bit more of him, admittedly. I'm really high on Kincaid. I know he's a little small. I know that smallness scares a lot of people after what happened with Sternberger, where he couldn't be fast and big. It wasn't possible for him, and so it just kind of washed out.
So for comparison, Sternberger's RAS is
6'5", I think.
5.17.
Oh, goodness. It was worse than I remembered.
Yeah, and then DeGuara's is 6.66 as a tight end.
But it's a lot better as a fullback.
Let him pick a fullback, much better as a fullback. Tunyon, however, did pretty well, 8.84.
Yeah. But let's get back to this pick, Dad, before we go on too big a tangent on tight ends. You said this is normally a spot you look at tight ends. Those top 3 tight ends are gone. The next one that I like is Laporta, but he's not quite going this high generally. Laporta out of Iowa, that is tight end. Tight end factory, Iowa. And then you said you normally look safety. Iowa. Normally you look safety here. I'm not a huge fan of the safeties that are here. I see you kind of zoning in on Sidney Brown. Defensive interior guy that I like here, if you felt like going in, for interior D-line, Siaki Ika is another guy that I think has some interesting explosiveness for his size. I don't know.
Yeah, so in terms of what I've done in the past, and often I've kind of traded to get myself into positions for players I want, either trading down. One safety I actually kind of like, who's seems to be able to do run support, hit, and do some covers. Antonio Johnson, but he went towards the end of he's already gone.
See, I'm not a big Antonio Johnson guy.
And I do like Sidney Brown. He was did very well apparently at the Senior Bowl. And there's another guy. Jamie Robinson's a little small, but he likes to hit. He's not afraid to get in there and do some run support.
Yeah,
but those guys are all a little rich for this point in the second round. We're kind of in a dead spot. Another group I like to get are D tackles. So one possibility could be.
I would be game for Ika here personally. I think that would be a pretty solid pick. How do you feel about maybe going tackle here?
We could go tackle. Another thing I've done in terms of we're looking at we were talking a little bit about center is John Michael Schmitz. Apparently was really looking good at the Senior Bowl, center from Minnesota.
See, I know we disagree on this. I just don't think they move on from Myers this quickly.
Maybe not, but if you're basically picking a tackle just for investment.
That's true.
If you're picking, and to pick one in round 2 at this point, I think would be a little surprising.
Okay.
I expect them to take 2 or 3 offensive linemen in the draft, but that I also expect them to wait until later rounds because it's not a pressing need at this point. So I could see they got 5, 7 round picks.
So let's take tackle off the board for now then, and let's think about D tackle, safety, or tight end. I personally like some of the later round safeties. I personally like Ronnie Hickman and Yair Brown more than most of these other guys at this spot. So I would lean Ika or Laporta, personally. I don't know about you.
I'm kind of looking. Of course, then there's the other tight end from Georgia, Darnell Washington. Is another guy
huge guy,
often in the
that's
second or third round. Is another player to throw out here. I mean, the Packers have the 38th pick, the 45th pick, and then the 78th pick coming up.
Yeah, big gap between that second rounder, their original second rounder, and then their third rounder. I kind of steered us on those first 2 picks a little bit, and I think we leaned a little more into what I was feeling. I know you're really high on Sidney Brown. Would you feel comfortable with him here, or would you want to wait on safety?
I think he's almost certainly going to be still around at 45. And there are other safeties that I like. I think actually I like the other safety from Alabama, Jordan Battle.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he's expected to go a little later, though some sites have him rated higher. I like him as a possibility in terms of what the Packers need at safety. But we could go for a big guy. I mean, they're a little bit harder to come by, though we could see if we basically have 3 more picks in the first 2 days left. And we think about what we want to do with these kind of higher value picks. We talked about really needing tight ends and really needing safeties.
Yeah.
And we don't yet have either. And we've got 3 picks left.
Yeah, and so that's why
I do feel like we could get a D tackle and then a safety and a tight end.
I think one of these 3 picks on day 2 in real life and here should be a tight end. I think that they've left that position kind of just ignored it for a very long time, and I think this is a really strong tight end class, which you don't get very often. I feel the same way about the safety position as a need. I don't feel the same way about the safety position in this year's draft class. I don't think it's a particularly strong safety class, whereas I think this is a tight end draft class that you can capitalize on. So I think this day 2, they should leave with one of, in our situation, with who is here, one of Laporta or Washington.
Yes.
So would you want to take Laporta here and then just let whatever falls to 45 fall? And because 3 tight ends already went off the board in this simulation. He's the next one off the board.
So we could go Laporta and then see who's left when we get to the next one. See if Ika is still there or not.
All right, I'm game for it. Let's go Laporta.
All right, let's go tight end. Let's go Laporta. He looks like he's got. I was watching. He's like breaking tackles, decent speed.
He's big. He moves well. I think the big question mark, based on what I've heard, is there are some question marks on his ball skills. But I think that he just doesn't look super graceful catching it sometimes, but he'll catch it. I'm really high on him. Just big and can move well is hard. You can't teach that. Fall into 45 here. Ika and Sidney Brown are both here on the board. you go ahead and take your pick, because I think they need a safety, and defensive interior is not as big a need. So if you're really high on Sidney Brown, I would be game for that as a pick, because they need a safety.
Double up and take Darnell Washington also.
Just tight ends on tight ends. We're going to run only 12 personnel every single time out. Maybe a little 13, put Mercedes with them.
We're going to be running like 4-0.
I would want to draft Washington just selfishly to be able to watch him learn from Mercedes Lewis, because I think that would be really fun to watch.
But anyway, let's say we'll go Ika now. Okay, they do need some more defensive help on the interior. There are some guys, not necessarily stars, that I think can help in the later rounds, but we're going to go with Ika and then hope that one of the safeties is still which are Brown, Battle, and so Sidney Brown,
Battle, and then
Jair Brown.
Yeah, I think it's actually pronounced Yair.
Yair?
I think it's a Y sound. And then I really like Ronnie Hickman as well. I think he's pretty good. He's a little slight, but I think he's a good player. But let's go.
Also, in terms of a second round receiver, I also like Michael Wilson,
I really like Michael Wilson. He was really good at the Senior Bowl. The health is such a red flag. He hasn't finished a season, I don't think, at Stanford.
He may not. But who was it? That franchise guy on YouTube gave his top 10, and he called Michael Wilson Diet Devontae Adams.
Michael Wilson moves really well for a big guy. There is a dearth of big guys in this draft for receiver, which we talked about with Johnson.
Throwing his name out there as an interesting prospect. But let's go big. Let's go big.
Go big or go home.
And then our defensive line is still not good enough. Let's go. Let's get one more. And now we'll see who lasts till 78.
Yeah, and so this is going to be the big waiting game, assuming they have these 2 seconds. And we're getting down here. If we're looking at that safety position, it's looking a little slim. However, Michael Wilson is still on the board.
Yes, Darnell Washington went the pick just before us. Jordan Battle went a few picks earlier. In terms of safeties that were left, there's other guys. J.L. Skinner, in terms of run support, I think isn't bad. I don't know if he did so well in the one-on-one and as a cover safety at the Senior Bowl. Yair Brown is still there, still expected to be around for a little bit longer, but I don't like waiting too long on a safety when we are so desperate for a safety. But it is true that like Michael Wilson's still there.
Derek Hall,
Rashee Rice is still there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think they would go running back here yet. I think they probably will still draft one. But
I'm guessing 4th or 5th round for a running back.
Okay, put this in your mind. Imagine Michael Wilson. Imagine he gets through the combine, the pre-draft process, etc. And let's say teams feel totally comfortable with his medicals. He could be a top 40, top 50 pick, in my opinion.
Yeah, he might not be here. He could be in the 2nd round pretty easily.
The reason he's falling this far is because of medical concerns. And so it's kind of baked into like his draft position is those health concerns, and that's the only reason he would be available this late. And so it comes down to the fact, like, do you think the Packers would want to take that kind of risk on a guy who might be a top 50 talent, top 60 talent, top 40 talent, somewhere in that range, something like top of day 2, like kind of talent, but I don't think he finished a season at Stanford, if I remember correctly, based on my initial studies. I can pull it up real quick.
Yeah, the other thing is, would they feel, they need to, just say reach for the health of Michael Smith after already getting Quentin Johnston
Michael
in
Wilson.
the first round. Michael Wilson.
He has played, I just looked it up because wait a second. He played 4 games in 2020, 4 games in 2021, and 6 games in 2022. So has barely played a half a season each of the last 3 years. I think that that's something you can't necessarily take a risk on, personally.
Yeah.
It's really hard. It's really hard when...
Yeah. So, and I think since they already have Johnston, I think they might... There's still some receivers they could take a reach on later, I think. We'll see who lasts that long. But I am feeling like about getting a safety, because I think we should leave with 2 and not want to get at least 1 safety before the end of day 2. So safeties I feel like are available are J.L. Skinner from Boise State.
It's a decent option.
And Yair Brown.
Yeah, I like him out of Penn State. I know we've been talking about him.
Penn State.
Brandon Joseph out of Notre Dame is still there. I wasn't super wild about him, but something to keep in mind. He's higher on their draft board than some of these other guys.
Maybe just beyond safety specifically here.
Beyond him, did Battle already go? I think he did. I think Skinner's the highest left.
Battle went about 5 or 6 picks earlier.
Either of the Florida guys, Rashad Torrance II or Trading III, are decent, but they don't really blow me away, and they're projected to go closer to the 4th, 5th round. We're kind of in that bit of that dead zone where any safety here I think would be a bit of a reach. That is the one concern here. I almost think they just double dip at receiver at this point. Michael Wilson's my favorite player left, but the red flags of the injury are just, I think, too much to bet on. I could see them going, what's his name from Michigan State? Jaden Reed had Jaden Reed had a really nice Senior Bowl. He is pretty small, also 6 foot, 185, and he's going to be 23 by the time the season starts. So there is that. What are your thoughts on Cedric Tillman?
He's a guy I haven't looked at yet. I've watched some of Reed. I've watched some of Rashee Rice, who I'm not so high on as some people. I feel like he wasn't separating all that well at the Senior Bowl, and he's not as big as people thought he was going to be. I've watched little A.T. Perry, little Trey Palmer, Marvin Mims, and Xavier Hutchinson. Guys I kind of like who are projected to go later.
So Cedric Tillman is one of the other few big guys in this draft at receiver. Tennessee had a really, really, really good year 2 years ago. And then this past year kind of dealt with ankle injuries and was never really quite 100%. He's got decent wiggle, decent after the catch, played opposite Jalen Hyatt for a lot of the year. Has a really big body that he uses in short to intermediate routes to kind of shield off defenders pretty well. A lot of this is stuff I heard on NFL Stock Exchange, just listening to that podcast, their opinions of him. He's someone that I would be interested with here if you would be fine with them taking another receiver. Tyler Scott is another very speedy guy out of Cincinnati. A lot of speed. Someone that they could find interesting. I think adding more speed on offense is never a bad thing. So I wouldn't go safety here necessarily. I would maybe go Tillman or Scott and then wait at safety. But I know it is hard to wait at safety when safety is such a need. We should probably get moving, though, because we are only in the 3rd round and we're getting close to the hour mark.
We are close to the hour mark. Okay, we've been talking a lot about each pick. I feel like we need to go safety here. And so then it's a matter, because I think we need more than one. Skinner is not so fast. He's a bigger guy. Probably not as good as coverage. Good run spurt. He's almost like he's like 6'4", 210. Yair Brown is 5'11", 208.
Yair Brown's a little small. He would be my pick just because I think he's my favorite safety that I've watched.
So I would be in favor of picking up Yair Brown.
Okay, let's go Yair Brown. I think it's a reach, but I like him as a player, and I could see him rising by the time the draft starts.
Yeah, some of this will depend on the testing play. So let's go there. So now we're through day 2, heading into their 4th round pick, the first of their picks here. And so now we're thinking a little bit about other players. Positions I'm often grabbing around here are like a second safety, or if I haven't picked up yet, a D lineman like Kendrick Coburn, or Zach Pickens, or a second wide receiver like Trey Palmer is a player I often get here. Or
I think here's also, I could see
Marvin
them starting
Mims,
to
maybe.
look at offensive linemen. Are there any here that you find yourself gravitating towards at the offensive line positions? Or, I mean,
not at this point. I've actually been waiting even later than this to pick up linemen. So I've been looking at more of the linemen who are available earlier. There are some running backs like Tajay Spears, or if I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was killing it at the Senior Bowl. Looked like the best player there. If you think it's time to get a running back, he's still available. The running backs I like that are usually often still available later here are Zach Evans, Kenny McIntosh, Tajay Spears.
So for me, I think I would have been comfortable taking a running back here if they weren't going to bring back Aaron Jones. The fact that most of those snaps are going to get eaten up by Jones and Dillon, I just don't see it being a super good use of resources to take one in the 4th round here.
Yeah, and this is the thing you feel about running backs. As opposed to some other positions, you can expect a good return from a rookie running back in their first year. So you can wait to draft a running back until the year you need them.
Exactly.
And so
here,
you don't,
I could
which
see,
is contrary to what the Packers did a couple years ago when they got A.J. Dillon.
I could see Joseph being an option here if they want to go safety and safety again. What are your thoughts about that?
That's the kind of thing they do a lot of, actually, is to double up at a position in the draft, sometimes even with back-to-back picks. Who else? I guess Joseph was probably the best of the safeties who are left.
Yeah, and then receivers who are left, I think that's another position that they might double up on.
Xavier Hutchinson, a bigger receiver at Iowa State. I don't know if he blocks as well as Lazard, but he's a big body.
I know there are some similarities between big guy from Iowa State.
Yep. Trey Palmer is a guy I think who's got some possibilities. Maybe Marvin Mims as well from Oklahoma. Other positions I think they're going to be looking to get. I think they'll probably add a corner at some point in the draft. They could also look.
I don't see them adding a corner until like the 6th or 7th round.
A
Personally,
late one. And there's some guys I like who often make it to the end of the 5th round. Julius Brents from Kansas State, who was looking really good at the Senior Bowl. Maybe he won't last this long. Some of the players I pick as I get later are sort of quirks of the ranking system of one site versus another. I often am looking at like 5 or 6 different sets of rankings to decide players that are bargain, a good value at a particular spot.
Yeah. Well, let's make a pick here. I'm not huge on Brandon Joseph personally. For me, I could see them going receiver again. And if you liked Xavier, sorry, I haven't watched him yet. It was Xavier Hutchinson.
Xavier Hutchinson, or maybe even the guy from Nebraska. Even more so, Trey Palmer. Mm-hmm. Trey Palmer?
Trey Palmer is Nebraska, yeah. Whichever one of those that you want to go with, I would lean Hutchinson just for another, I think, size guy. And then
look
Palmer,
up again how big Palmer is.
Palmer is
he's got some
6'1", 190.
6'1", 193.
Yeah.
Not
and
as big as Hutchinson.
Hutchinson
is like 6'3",
is
200 something.
6'3", 205.
Yeah. But I think Palmer looks like he's got a little bit more speed. And
okay, let's go Palmer. Let's go Palmer and let it take us.
I've kind of liked Palmer what I've seen, so we'll go for our second wide receiver here in the 4th, and now we'll see, because I think they're going to take 2, and it kind of depends on how many picks they end up with. Now we're at we're 151. We're in the 5th round now. I often grab the best cornerback left or running back at this point.
Like I said with Aaron Jones getting drafted, I think they might just stick with a undrafted free agent here.
That's
with that
possibility.
3rd running back spot, and then wait a year or two to address that position.
They could go for corner depth. They could go. Is there another tight end they might want to go for? They could also start to look at offensive linemen. So who's here that I like now in the later rounds? Don't know enough about some of these guys. But they could get Julius Brents here.
Another safety.
Or they could go for another D tackle. Let's see who's left at Slade from Michigan State. If they want to, or who's another edge? Is there any edge that I like?
See, I think that if they're going to take Ika that high, that they're going to not necessarily address the position again, because they're going to want to give Wyatt snaps. Clark's there. I think they like what they've gotten out of Slayton. Like we've seen, they tend to take these defensive interior guys on a little slowly, and so I could imagine Wyatt having a big role next year. So I don't know that they would necessarily go defensive interior here, especially...
What do you think about a second edge rusher?
I think that makes some sense, especially with Gary's injury, and they're going to need guys to eat snaps early. I could see that happening if there's a guy that you like here.
I think I like Otron Mathis, but I have to double check on that.
Okay, well, let's think a little bit about... So Mathis out of
Nebraska.
Out of Nebraska. You're going to go back-to-back Nebraska.
He's got a pretty decent pass rush win rate, and run stop rate are pretty good for another fifth round edge rusher.
12 games played this last year, had 25 hurries, 5 hits, and 3 sacks. Decent production. I mean, it's a fifth-round pick. You're not going to have a perfect player. They're listing him at 6'5", 260. Bigger guy. I know the Packers like those bigger guys on the edges, or at least historically have. I could see that definitely being the pick. Do you want to stick that and write it in ink?
Sure.
Run the card
I'll go ahead and grab him. Yasir Abdullah from Louisville's another possibility.
I've watched him, and he just seems really small. His legs seem small. I don't know if he's really the type of edge rusher they go for. He seems like light in the pants, as they would say with draft jargon. I think he needs to put on weight.
All
I
right,
don't know. That's how I feel about him. Let's go Mathis.
I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit here as we go on.
Yeah, we got
now we are
3 more picks, 4 more picks.
No, we got one more 5th rounder, no 6th rounder, and 5 7th rounders.
And the 7th rounders might as well be dart throws. We'll try and power through those, but let's take our time here, at least on this last 5th rounder. Dad, who do you like here? What position do you usually go for? Is this another safety?
This
probably
had been my my running back spot, but yeah, we don't have our second safety yet. So I would often get like Kenny McIntosh this round, but if we want to wait even longer, or just going to go, UDFA with Jones re-signing recently. Let's see who's DeMarco Helms is a guy actually a third safety from Alabama. Is a guy I kind of like as a late safety here.
I am mostly going to defer to you at this point in our mock draft. These are some of the guys that I have not quite gotten the chance to watch as closely as you have, I know. Helms, just looking at this, had just a 10% missed tackle rate as a safety. That's not great, but not horrible. Playing at Alabama, he was an elite prospect coming out of high school. Beyond that, played 900 defensive snaps for Bama this past year, 760 the year before. Played 151 snaps in the slot, 206 in the box, and then 535 deep. So majority of the time spent deep, but did play at a few different levels of the defense. Beyond that, Dad, any thoughts on him? For him, I'm just kind of going through their player profile. Graded out better against the run than in coverage, but graded about average in coverage. Like we said, PFF grades aren't a perfect metric, but they are something to go off of at least. I would be game for going with him here. I think they need more safety depth. I think they're desperate for more safety depth. And taking a flyer on a guy who went to Bama is not a bad option. In
terms of who's left, he's probably, at this point, maybe the best. Go for a second safety here. Let's take Helms. And now we start getting into the. So I suppose I could have looked at offensive linemen at that spot. That's one thing I forgot to do to see who was available, because there are some guys I like around the 200 turn. And let's see who's still here now.
Yeah, I think 2 of these 7th-round picks would be... I think realistically that 6th-round pick probably would have been an offensive lineman. I think taking a second defensive interior guy was a bit of a
Yeah, and there's the one tackle that I kind of like, who might go a little earlier, just went just before us. And there's some other, I think, tackles I like. But
who was the tackle you liked?
Wanya Morris from Oklahoma.
Okay.
I think he's a little bit more can play tackle than some of the other guys who are here. But I like the 2 Oregon linemen, T.J. Bass and Alex Forsyth, the center. Bass played tackle, but he's projected to be a guard because of his shorter arms. And then other guys.
That's the kind of guy that the Packers generally take and move to guard.
Yep. And Richard Garej, or I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, from Florida, and John Ojukwu from Boise State. These guys, I think Garej maybe has more tackle potential than Bass, and Forsyth is a center. So,
like I said, I'm gonna defer to you here with these later 7th-round picks. I do think they go offensive line just to give my input on positional here. Value. I think it would surprise me for them to not have taken an offensive lineman at this point in the draft. I think they'll probably take one earlier than this. For us, though, it was just value on the board with what was there. We liked the guys who weren't playing offensive linemen at those spots more. I know we didn't necessarily discuss the offensive linemen as much, but pretty much at every single one of those picks, there was a guy staring us in the face we really were high on, and one of us was at least very high on. And we had to take just the player we thought was a good player. But here, Dad, let's go with that Oregon tackle.
I'll go with Bass here at pick 234, and now we go 3 spots later to 237. Do we get a second edge yet?
At this point, we have.
Yes,
gone,
we did.
Yes,
we
took the guy.
We took Mathis from Nebraska. I was thinking another edge I often get in the 7th round is Habakkuk Baldonado. I think he's a very interesting player. I don't know if he'll actually last this long. I think he's got a good athletic profile, but he's only been playing football for like 4 years. I forget where he moved to the U.S. from and only played 1 year of high school football. So he's an interesting prospect to pick up late as a second edge rusher. But I might actually double up on O-line here.
I think that's something the Packers do a lot, so I could totally see that
happening. Oops, I didn't get the... So I'm thinking the Oregon center, actually, going back to Oregon, Forsyth, as a late round center, I think is probably the best of the interior linemen available. So I'm going to grab him.
I wonder if he's related to the Forsyth that came out of Florida a few years ago.
I don't know, and I don't know if that Forsyth had an E at the end or not. This one does not.
Something to look up later.
We could get a 7th round running back now.
I think that would be very reasonable.
I think it's Taiwan Evans from Louisville. He's
great
also got some pass. Right, perfect. He's got to be a star. He's got, I think, also some pass catching ability. If I could double check on that. And he's. I haven't watched film of him yet, but he's a possibility here as one of these last few picks to add a really late round.
I think a late round running back would be a great pick. I like I said, I don't know. I don't think they're going to go as high as I initially thought with the fact Jones coming back, but a 7th rounder. I mean, Patrick Taylor's fine. There's room for improvement at that 3rd spot, and we've seen hey, Jones isn't playing. There's some problems there with not having that second speedier back, who's more established in the passing. And Dylan's a fine receiving back, but
so Evans,
not as good.
Taiwan Evans is not necessarily a speed guy, but he's described as being a natural pass catcher. So he's a possibility. Then maybe we get a pick a 7th round cornerback kind of thing they've done before. Maybe Ward from LSU. But let's grab our 7th round running back now, if you're all right with that.
Yep, sounds good to me. And remind me where he went to college again.
Louisville.
Nice. All right, and then one more 7th
2 picks left.
Oh, 2 picks left. Oh, that's right. 5 7th round picks, not 4 this year.
Yeah.
4 last year.
I sometimes get a second interior linemen late. Another thing I get is I almost always get a second tight end. I like a guy from North Dakota State. Didn't do a lot, but he looks like he could be athletic and a bigger guy, Noah Gindorf.
That's a great name.
As just to grab a guy who might have some upside from North Dakota State as a 7th round tight end, as a second tight end.
Let's do it. 6'6", 268. He only played in 3 games this past year for North Dakota State, but the previous year he did play in 12. I think another tight end totally makes sense. It's a room that's kind of a bit lacking in talent, and a 7th rounder isn't necessarily going to make a big dent there, but they need more players in that room because I think Tyler Davis should be challenged for snaps.
Yeah, and I think this guy has some ability to maybe do a little yak and hit people. So I think
Let's go
worth
Gindor.
7th. And then when we have our last pick, sometimes I get another D tackle. As a 7th round D tackle, I like Devonshire Maxwell, who's still on the board. Or another guy I like is Nesta Jade Silvera, who's often in it's like a 4th or 5th round grade in other sites. If we want, or a corner, which we don't have a corner yet.
I really think they're fine at corner. I really do.
Yeah, because
I think they have enough.
They have safeties who are
going to play corner.
Slot.
There's safeties who are going to play corner. So it's like I think they're fine at corner. Maybe they take another one, maybe late, but I think they have other needs. I could see another defensive interior guy.
Yeah, and I kind of like. He's got a good run defensive grade. I mean, is UT
it's the
Chattanooga,
7th round.
So,
you're not going to have great.
And so we're just taking a flyer on a guy who.
So which one did you end up going with?
Devonshire Maxwell
Out of Chattanooga.
Yeah, we could
Nice.
I could take a quick comparison of these two guys. I think I mostly liked Maxwell over Silvera in the end, in terms of size and other profiles. So let's just go back. Let's just go Maxwell. It's one of those two guys.
Okay.
So I'll go
And that
Devonshire
is
Maxwell.
our first official mock draft of the season, Dad. Do you want to read off the players really quick who we selected, and then we'll take a screenshot. We'll post this to our Twitter as well, our first official mock draft of the year. We're going to try and have a few more mock drafts as the season goes on, maybe post, maybe not in podcast form, but post a few on our Twitter. So we'll have a screenshot of this up on our Twitter later today with this episode.
Yeah.
Dad, read us off these selections.
Should I copy that and text you that?
Just screenshot it to me later, but for now, just read them off, and we'll wrap up this episode. So with the Packers,
We've got Quentin Johnston
at the 7th overall pick. Sorry, go ahead.
Miles Murphy at the 15th pick, and we got rated with an A and an A- for those two picks. Sam Laporta, they thought we reached a little bit at tight end, but I think in terms of if we wanted to get one of the top tight ends, I think that round 2 pick was where we had to go. One of those 2 round 2 picks. Siaki Ika, defensive tackle from Baylor. Yair Brown, safety from Penn State. We took him a little earlier than they say he's still going to be available, but I didn't want to count on him still being there at pick 116.
Yep, 100% agree.
And then we doubled up on Nebraska players with Trey Palmer. So now we've also now doubled up on former Nebraska wide receivers.
Yes.
With Trey Palmer joining his ex-teammate Samari Toure.
Mm-hmm.
We've got, as a depth edge rusher behind Murphy and our current players, O'Shawn Mathis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm kind of making it up as I go along. Second safety, DeMarco Helms from Alabama. He's probably more of a run defender than cover corner at this point, is what it seems like. Couple of depth offensive linemen from Oregon, probably both going to end up on the interior, I think, based on arm length and other measurables. But TJ Bassett played tackle for Oregon, and Alex Forsyth, center. Give a little. I think the Packers, you just count on them always grabbing a couple offensive linemen every draft. Keep building depth. Tywon Evans, a 7th round running back.
Tyon, I think.
Oh, Tyon, not Tywon.
Tyon or Tion? Tyon.
Tion. Yeah,
Could be any.
I don't know. Noah Gindorf.
There's no W though. You were manifesting.
Oh, did I go
W.
Taiwan instead of Taiyan?
Yes.
Taiyan. Yes, I was changing that Y into a W. Maybe it's an upsilon.
And then Gindorf, tight end, North Dakota State, and then Devonta Maxwell, defensive interior, out of Chattanooga. And so this has been our first mock draft of the season. I think it adds a lot in that receiver room and along the defensive line, two places that the Packers are kind of in need of talent at this point. Getting another tight end or two, also really important. That room is been kind of ignored for a long time. I guess not ignored, but swung and miss on Jay Sternberger. And then you have a decent fullback in DeGuara, but I think maybe they thought he'd be more than that, spending a third-round pick on him. If you have any thoughts on this mock draft, let us know. I know that probably they would maybe look to add a safety earlier. We just didn't like how the board fell for safety. It just is how it is sometimes. Sometimes it's not the perfect solution there. It would be interesting to see what they ended up going with at the safety positions if this was their draft. If you have any thoughts, though, let us know on Twitter. Let us know what you liked. Let us know what you didn't like. We're open to criticism. And as the pre-draft and combine rest of the offseason go on, the draft positions for a lot of these players are going to change. Players that we took in the second round, like Ika, maybe might rise to as a first rounder, might not be available there at 45 anymore. A player like Quentin Johnson, if he doesn't test as expected, maybe there's no way he goes as high as 7. You never know. But this is kind of just to set the tone for where we are with the Packers draft as from like a conceptual point of view, where we think they're going to attack, and then also some players that we're high on right now. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Father Son Packers podcast. Dad, do you have anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up here?
Nope. I would just say that we did this on the PFF machine. I usually mock draft on like 3 or 4 different sites because they all have different rankings, and it's easy to fall into favoring players at a particular round because of where they're ranked in whatever system you're using. So I usually pull up like 3 or 4 different rankings, and I'll try mock drafts on a couple different sites to try to get a feel for different players falling in different positions. But I do think structurally we can expect a tight end or a safety in the first 2 days. Maybe they'll trade so that the pick value lines up with the player projected position. It's something we didn't do. It's like trade back and then pick one of the safeties later in the second. But I think we're going to see a tight end or 2 this draft, a safety or 2 this draft. You're always going to get some linemen, and I actually expect maybe not 7th pick overall, but they're going to get a couple of wide receivers again because they don't have very many.
Yes. And for all your draft needs, like I said, make sure to follow our Twitter. We'll be tweeting out about the draft the rest of the year. Come listen to shows as we go. We'll be talking about the Combine coming up, what players have the most to gain, what players have the most to prove. We'll be talking about free agency as we track this Aaron Rodgers situation, and we'll be tracking the rest of the Packers' moves as they try and get under the cap for this coming year. So come give us a listen going forward. Thanks so much for listening here. Find us on all podcast platforms, and until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go. Maybe